Romanticism is one of the most important historical events of all time. Unlike a lot of what gets called history, Romanticism isn't a war or a piece of technology or a political event. It refers to the birth of a new set of ideas. It's about a mindset and a way of feeling. Romanticism began in Western Europe in the mid-18th century in the work of artists, poets and philosophers, and it subsequently spread all over the world, changing how millions of people look at nature, children, love, sex, money and work. We are all now, more or less, in some aspects of our sensibilities, romantics. Romanticism is best understood as a reaction to the birth of the modern world and some of its key features: industrialization, urbanization, secularization, and consumerism. What follows are some of the central moments in the history of Romanticism. The Marais, Paris, May 1762. The Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau publishes a book about the raising of children, Émile, or On Education. It contains diatribes against the oppressive world of adults and praises the natural goodness, spontaneity and wisdom of little children. It is at points extremely anxious to get mothers to breastfeed their offspring, the first sustained argument for this practice in Western civilization. The world around Rousseau is growing ever more rational, scientific and technologically based. It's increasingly sensible, planned, sterile and bureaucratic. Against all of this, Rousseau emphasizes the child, the original rebel, the representative of everything that's pure, unschooled and outside of adult discipline. It's the seat of creativity and genius. For the first time in Western history, glamour is directed not at the attainment of reason and adult self-control, but at the freedom from tradition and the natural innocence and sweetness of the child. Brook Street, London, August 1770. A precocious 17-year-old poet called Thomas Chatterton downs some arsenic and ends his life in a tiny attic apartment. He kills himself because no one wants to publish his poetry, which is concerned with beauty and wisdom, and because his uncomprehending family are applying pressure for him to become a lawyer. A cult soon grows up around the young, beautiful poet with shoulder-length chestnut hair. He becomes an emblem of something that will become very important for romantics: the idea of the sensitive, doomed person, often an artist, rejected by a cruel, vulgar world. Chatterton stands at the head of a long line of romantic heroes that will stretch from Byron to Keats to Van Gogh and eventually all the way to Jim Morrison and Amy Winehouse. Romanticism borrows from Christianity. The romantic hero is a secularized, Christ-like figure, the loser who is in truth deeply noble in the eyes of the few who understand. Leipzig, Germany, 1774. The German author Goethe publishes the quintessential romantic love story, The Sorrows of Young Werther. It tells the story of a passionate, doomed love affair between a young poet called Werther and a beautiful, clever young woman called Charlotte. Unfortunately for Werther, Charlotte is married, so the love is impossible from the very start. But that doesn't stop Werther, a dreamy and practical young man who loves the arts above all else. Like Chatterton, Werther is under pressure to have a sensible career and join bourgeois life, but he can think of only one thing: the impulses of his heart. Eventually, Werther can't take it anymore and kills himself. But rather than condemning him as a lunatic and a hothead, Goethe, one of the founding fathers of Romanticism, directs all our sympathies towards Werther. We're supposed to be on his side, admiring his passionate and entirely impractical attitude to love. The book becomes the most popular novel of a generation. 3 million copies are printed. Napoleon declares it the greatest work of European literature, and it dramatically changes how many people think of love, privileging dramatic outpourings of feeling over more traditional, rational concerns for class, lineage, and money. For a romantic, it's always right and noble to follow your heart. The disastrous results that follow aren't any argument, they're just proof of how desiccated and heartless the so-called adult, sensible world can be. Madrid, Spain, 1798. The artist Francisco Goya produces one of his most iconic images, titled "The Sleep of Reason Brings Out Monsters." It captures a quintessential romantic interest in the limits of reason and the power of the irrational over humans' fragile minds. To be romantic is to have sympathy for madness and to hold an almost vengeful attitude towards bombastic claims as to the triumph of rationality, science and logic. The Lake District, England, December 1799. A young English poet called William Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy move into what's set to become one of the most famous residences in the history of English literature, Dove Cottage in Grasmere on the edge of the Lake District. Here they will spend the next 9 years, and Wordsworth will write some of the greatest poetry in the English language, celebrating something that's very under threat, the natural world. He'll write about daffodils, oak trees, clouds, butterflies and rivers, and his work will charm and seduce Europe. Within a generation there will, in Wordsworth's own estimation, be more tourists than sheep in the Lake District. Most importantly, running through Wordsworth's poetry is an abiding hatred for everything mechanical and industrial. When many years later a railway line threatens to pass through the Lake District, Wordsworth and his followers do everything they can to have the train, a symbol of Wordsworth's hated technology, rerouted. To be a romantic is to take the side of nature against industry. It's to prefer a daffodil to a viaduct, a tree to a factory. At the moment when huge swathes of Britain are being covered in the often monstrous new cities that are making Europe rich, Wordsworth, the quintessential romantic, speaks up for the natural and the simple life. Niagara, United States, September 1829. The American painter Thomas Cole paints one of his most characteristic images of the mighty Niagara Falls with a couple of Native Americans in the foreground. Cole makes his name as a painter of sublime scenes, vast landscapes of the American interior, showing nature at its most dignified and impressive. Man looks lost and puny by comparison. This too is a typical romantic attitude, for romantics don't believe in God, but they go in search of the emotions one might once have had around religion, and locate them in the big, wide-open spaces of nature. To be a romantic is to find relief from the pressures of competitive city life in the sort of natural grandeur that transcends all human achievements and concerns.
All right. So if you think of a pendulum swinging, Enlightenment is on one end and Romanticism is on the other. Romanticism is a reaction to the birth of the modern world, right? So all these cities booming up and industry, factories, trains, all these sorts of things. And some people were like, whoa, hold on, I don't like this, right? And those are our romantics. So the Age of Enlightenment took place between the early 1700s and the early 1800s, and you'll notice Romanticism comes straight after that. So early 1800s to the mid 1800s is the time period that we're in. Although Romanticism started in Europe, it did make its way to the United States. So the Age of Enlightenment emphasized logic and reason, whereas the Romantics emphasized imagination and emotion. So what you'll see is that a lot of the literary texts during the Enlightenment era are kind of essays. I don't want to say boring, but dry. Whereas Romanticism, there's a boom in fiction, story writings, poetry, that sort of thing. You've also got really intense emotions. I mean, from the video, people falling in love, people suffering from not being able to follow their heart because of family expectations or society, and so a lot of those stories, a lot of people are killing themselves. So really intense emotions. Age of Enlightenment, they were really interested in science, whereas Romanticism, they were interested in nature, in legends, and in the supernatural. Now, Romantics didn't necessarily believe in God, but they found their spirituality in nature, and they valued nature far above industry. I mean, they didn't value industry, really. So, the Age of Enlightenment was focused on society as a whole, making society better. Think about Thomas Paine, think about Phyllis Wheatley, whereas Romanticism focused on the individual. So you have these stories where you're getting to know a character and what they're going through and how they're feeling and what happens to them. So what can you expect to find in Romantic literature? So writers during the Romantic time period, they're really capitalizing on their imagination, so some really imaginative stories. You've also got emotion, like I said before, supernatural, legends and history, and nature. So those are things that you're looking to find throughout the next couple weeks when you read 4 different pieces of literature. So the first piece that we're going to be reading is The Devil and Tom Walker. And the man who wrote it, his name is Washington Irving, who you have probably heard of whether or not you realize it. So he was born in New York City in 1783. He was the youngest of 11 children. His parents were Scottish English immigrants. He was actually named after George Washington, and he attended the presidential inauguration of Washington in 1789. He received a private education, but he barely passed the bar in 1806 to practice law. His desire was really to pursue writing. He toured Europe for a couple years. He traveled to England to help his brothers with a family business. And while he was there, he met Sir Walter Scott, who is a famous Scottish novelist, playwright, and poet. And Scott advised Irving to read the German Romantic authors and consider folklore and legends for writing inspiration, which is exactly what Irving did. He wrote Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which I am confident you've seen some sort of cartoon adaptation, at least, of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, especially around Halloween. He also wrote The Devil and Tom Walker in 1824, which is a story that we're going to read. And this story is very similar to the German legend of Faust. And in that German legend, Faust is the main character, and he sells his soul to the devil for knowledge. And in The Devil and Tom Walker is going to sell his soul to the devil as well, but for something different. So Washington Irving also wrote some historical and biographical works about Christopher Columbus and George Washington. He served as the U.S. ambassador for Spain in the 1840s. He did push for stronger copyright laws, and he died at his estate on November 28th in 1859. So, the reading strategy that I'm going to have you guys practice is to visualize. And instead of just visualizing the story in your head as you're reading, as so many of you do, I'm going to actually have you draw the illustrations in the left-hand margins every time it says stop and draw. So as you read a paragraph, think about, what does this look like? How can I draw this? And you'll notice yourself going back to reread, which is also a great reading strategy to help with comprehension. So I did the first part for you. And so you can use these ideas, or you can go your own direction if you want. So in this left-hand margin is where we're drawing. So the learning target is to read closely to determine what the text says explicitly. Now, the text has some challenging vocabulary and some long sentences, and so this is one of the reasons why drawing is really going to help, because otherwise you may find yourself reading, a whole page and being like, I have no idea what's happening. So the directions are just to read the paragraph, and then you're going to stop and draw. Now, this very first one, I actually found it easier to combine these 2 paragraphs, and so there's one drawing for both of them. But most of the time, you're going to just have one drawing next to each paragraph. And I am not looking for anything elaborate. I mean, this is the most elaborate you're probably going to get. Then, on the right-hand side, what you're going to do is you're going to annotate where you see the elements of romantic literature. So imagination, emotion, nature, legend, supernatural, those sorts of things. And so the learning target on this side is to understand how the content of text can be shaped by these romantic elements. So what you'll notice, I'll just read this first part to you, and then I'll explain the drawing. So a few miles from Boston in Massachusetts, there's a deep inlet winding several miles into the interior of the country from Charles Bay and terminating in a thickly wooded swamp or morass. On one side of this inlet is a beautiful dark grove. On the opposite side, the land rises abruptly from the water's edge into a high ridge on which grow a few scattered oaks of great age and immense size. So you've got some descriptions of nature there. And so what you have is like this little river, this little stream coming in and ending in a swamp. And it's a very wooded area, and there's a hill that rises here right next to the swamp with a couple trees on it. So in this next paragraph it says, under one of these gigantic trees, according to old stories, there was a great amount of treasure buried by Kidd the pirate. The inlet allowed a facility to bring the money in a boat secretly and at night to the very foot of the hill. The elevation of the place permitted a good lookout to be kept, that no one was at hand, while the remarkable trees formed good landmarks by which the place might easily be found again. So what you have is you have this boat, right? And on it is Kidd the pirate with his treasure that he's stolen. And he's taking it in here and bringing it to the other edge of the swamp, and he's burying it right under this tree at the bottom of the hill. So X marks the spot where the treasure is. This is a legend, right? You've got this pirate, you've got this buried treasure, and so there's legend has it that there's this buried treasure there. All right, so it goes on to say the old stories add, moreover, that the devil presided at the hiding of the money and took it under his guardianship. But this, it is well known, he always does with buried treasure, particularly when it has been ill gotten. Be that as it may, Kidd never returned to recover his wealth, being shortly after seized at Boston, sent out to England, and there hanged for a pirate. Now, pardon the glare on my images, but I've drawn the devil here, and he's guarding the money. That's money he's holding on to. So we've got the supernatural with the devil, and we've got Kidd the pirate being seized at Boston, sent to England, and hanged. And so we've got some history there. So, last paragraph I'm going to do with you. About the year 1727, just at the time when earthquakes were prevalent in New England and shook many tall sinners down upon their knees, there lived near this place a meager, miserly fellow of the name of Tom Walker. He had a wife as miserly as himself. They were so miserly that they even conspired to cheat each other. Whatever the woman could lay hands on, she hid away. A hen could not cackle, but she was on the alert to secure the new laid egg. Her husband was continually prying about to detect her secret hoards, and many and fierce were the conflicts that took place about what ought to have been common property. So I've drawn her here, and she's kind of looking over her shoulder, trying to hide this egg from him, and I drew him here with binoculars, trying to see what she's doing. And then I drew him fighting down here, black and blue eye, bloody nose, that kind of stuff. So lots of intense emotions in this conflict, right?